Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, January 15th, 2015. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week, Chris Colby, editor of beerandwinejournal.com, shares some tips about brewing Maibock, a style to brew now and enjoy in warmer times. And he answers some follow-up questions on carbonation. If you're new to home brewing or would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. You can follow me on Twitter. My username is Basic Brewing, all one word. We also have a Basic Brewing Radio and Basic Brewing Video page on Facebook at facebook.com/basicbrewing. We are on the Google Plus, too. Thanks again to everybody clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. Whenever you think of Amazon, think of us and click on our associate link first. It won't cost you any extra, and you'll be helping us to bring you this show, and we greatly appreciate your support. We also have associate links for Brew Your Own Magazine and the American Homebrewers Association on our site as well. You can find our Basic Brewing iPhone app on iTunes, our Android app on Amazon.com. We have a Windows Phone app. We're on the BlackBerry Podcast Directory. We're on the Stitcher app. We're just everywhere. If you want to put a tip in our tip jar, some coinage in our guitar case, you can go to basicbrewing.com/support. And thanks to everybody who has done so already. And if you put a tip in the tip jar, you will get a link to the video, the bonus video that Steve and I produced just for people who have the app and who have donated to the contributed to the tip jar. Steve made up some delicious cabbage rolls using a homemade sauerkraut as a part of it, and some homebrew as well. The temperatures around northwest Arkansas have been fairly chilly lately. I know it's not as cold as other places, but the thermometer in my basement is headed down toward lager fermenting temperatures, and that's got me itching to brew a lager. So today's topic is appropriate. Chris Colby is posting a series on brewing Maibock this week on beerandwinejournal.com. That is beerandwinejournal.com. So I wanted him to talk about that. And while I had him on the line, I had him answer some mailbag questions that were appropriate as well. Chris Colby, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Hey, James. Thanks for having me on the show.
Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year, 2015.
At what point is it proper to stop saying Happy New Year? Have we gone past that?
I don't know. That's a good question.
If you're saying Happy New Year in February, you've missed it somehow.
Yeah, I think you can carry it through January.
Yeah, and plus this is the first time we've officially talked to each other on the record, so there you go. I have a couple of questions that came in after the carbonation episode that I thought we could knock out before getting on to the Maibock. This first one comes from Sean, who says, I'm sure you've covered this in the distant past, but I'm hoping you will cover it again. That is, why degas? Does it affect taste? What's the best way to degas, etc.? So in the carbonation show, we're talking about how to get carbonation into the beer. Is there a time when we would want it out?
No, degassing is something that winemakers do when they're trying to make a still wine, and it's usually only when they're trying to. You see it in kit wines a lot when you're trying to make something the wine quickly. If you're making the normal way wine is made, it gets fermented, then it gets racked to barrels potentially, or another stainless vessel, and it usually sits and ages long enough that the carbonation just leaves the wine normally. But if you're trying to sort of rush things through, have a still wine that's produced quickly, you need to stir it to get all the carbon dioxide out of solution that builds up during fermentation. In beer, though, since there really aren't there, at least I can't even think of a beer that's served still on purpose. You normally try to retain the CO2, and even though you're going to add it later with bottle priming or forced carbonation, there's no real reason that you would ever want to stir out the CO2. So yeah, degassing is just not something that that brewers do, because you want the final product to have an amount of CO2 like more then it's going to be retained by the beer when it's at fermentation temperature under atmospheric pressure. Later on it becomes you at some point you put the beer in a pressure vessel, either a bottle that has a cap on it or a keg that has CO2 pressure on it. And, more CO2 is added either through the in bottle conditioning when the yeast eat the sugar and produce carbon dioxide, or in a keg with, pressurized CO2 on the headspace of the beer to force more CO2 into it. So, yeah, we didn't cover degassing because there's no reason for it.
Now, I have had a braggot that was still.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's on purpose or if that's par for the course with that style, or even then, I don't know that you would have to degas it.
Yeah, I actually don't know stylistically what braggots shoot for, but it's a kind of mead, and there are still meads. Usually meads take long enough to ferment that I really don't know a lot of mead makers who worry about degassing. If you're really trying to rush a mead, from fermentation into the bottles, you might want to, sanitize a whisk or something, stainless steel whisk, and beat it a little bit before, you bottle it just to whip some of the carbonation out of it. But yeah, in general, I don't think that's really necessary. I mean, occasionally you'll run into a lambic that's still, but that's usually because the carbonation has escaped the bottle. It's not something that was designed that they wanted to shoot for. And I also think, I'm not 100% sure of this, but I think there are some microorganisms that will actually take in CO2 and convert it to something else. So in some lambics, they might be being robbed of their CO2. I'll have to check on that, though. I don't know.
Got another question from Joe in Austin, Texas, who should just come to a Zealots meeting and ask you in person, right?
Sure.
But Joe says, I recently started dabbling with nitrogen, and my research into the process found some conflicting or possibly incomplete information from various sources. It seems that there are a number of options and possibilities. It'd be great to hear from you and others about what processes work best. So we didn't, in our talk about carbonation, I don't think we covered nitrogen. So we could spend a couple of minutes on that. We've had nitrogen beers on tap. Is it something that's available locally, or how do you get it? What is it, and how does it work?
Yeah, the sort of basic nitrogen setup is you'll get a tank of what's called beer gas. It's 70% nitrogen, N2, and 30% carbon dioxide, CO2. And it comes in a gas tank just like CO2 does, but given that it's a different gas, it requires an entirely different regulator. So you've got to get the nitrogen beer gas regulator. And then when you sort of nitrogenate as opposed to carbonate say like a dry stout, dry stout's probably the biggest or the most well-known example of a beer that's pushed with nitrogen. You put it under quite a lot of pressure with the nitrogen, because nitrogen compared to carbon dioxide is very insoluble in water. So you you keg the beer, put it on beer gas, and leave it at about 30 psi, which is almost 3 times as much pressure as the pressure for serving a normal beer is. A normal carbonated beer is serving pressure a lot of times is at least in the vicinity of 10 psi. So anyway, there's a lot of pressure, and corny kegs will easily take that much pressure. They'll take up to about 100 psi before they will lose their integrity. So you don't have to worry about that. But put about 30 psi of pressure on it, and even though you start with 70% nitrogen and 30% carbon dioxide, you end up pushing most of the carbon dioxide into the beer because it's very soluble, and only a little bit of nitrogen enters the beer. Trying to think if I can put numbers to that.
But the effect is kind of a creamier, silkier mouthfeel on the beer.
Right. Yeah. Oh, and here I just looked it up. In a nitrogen push beer, there's around 2,400 milligrams per liter of CO2 and only about 20 milligrams per liter of N2 nitrogen. So, yeah, very little nitrogen, even though that's the bulk of the gas and it's under a lot of pressure. The bulk of the fizz, even in a nitrogenated beer, is still from CO2, but that little bit of nitrogen creates very fine bubbles and gives some people describe it as creamy, but it gives that everyone's had a Guinness, is that sort of Guinness like or Murphy Stout when it's in the widget can mouthfeel.
Now, you wouldn't keep it on 30 psi to serve the beer, right?
Yeah, you actually keep it at 30 psi because in addition to having a different gas cylinder and regulator, you also have a different tap faucet, and this provides the necessary restriction that both keeps it from, like, if you opened up a CO2 tap at 30 psi, it'd be like a fire hose of beer coming out. But on the for the stout taps, it's called, some people call it a restrictor tap because it's got a little plate with a bunch of little holes drilled in it, and that not only creates more restriction so that it balances out the pressure, but it also sort of forces that nitrogen, the nitrogen bubbles out of solution and to make that nice big, foamy dry stout head.
And I've had a pale ale on nitrogen once, and it wasn't good. It was too soft for the style, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's at a lot of bars you see, if they have a nitrogen setup, sometimes they'll want to put different things on it just to, like, say we have this beer but pushed on nitrogen, and you see the same thing with cask conditioned, or occasionally served from firkins or whatever. And yeah, the sort of carbonation or nitrogenation or either of those that you use for beers, sometimes it's got to be matched to the beer. Like, I've had cask conditioned IPAs, and I don't think I've ever had one that I've really liked because it seems like you just need that full amount of carbonation to bring up the hops. And nitrogen beers I don't think work well with hoppy styles. They work well with sort of roasty styles, and that's a fairly strong flavor, but they don't seem to work. They work nice on, like, bitters, British bitter, which isn't fantastically hoppy, and I've had some other styles, but for the most part, dry stouts are where that treatment really shines. And I think beyond that, you need to pick and choose what's going to be appropriate. One interesting thing I think is with the explosion of sort of Belgian derived styles or Belgian inspired beers. A lot of those are highly carbonated. It might be interesting for some of them, since they're not, by and large, very hoppy beers, is to try going the other way and either cask conditioning or trying pushing them through nitro. And it might be a trial and error process where you have quite a few errors along the way, but you might find a style that actually sort of the combination of lower carbonation or nitrogenation actually melds well with the kind of beer.
Yeah, I could see like a double or maybe a quad might be tasty.
Yeah, worth a shot at least if you have the setup.
Well, let's talk about another big beer. It is a beer probably best enjoyed in the spring, maybe. But if it's a lager, it's a big lager. So in order to get the beer ready for spring, you might think about doing it right about now, and that is Maibock. Yeah,
Maibock, which translates from the German into Bock beer for May, the month of May. Um, yeah, it's a really nice style of beer. Uh, and also in addition to having the word May in the title, it's a nice spring beer in that it's similar to Bock's in that it's a strong lager, but it's different from most of the other beers in the Bock family in that it's a pale beer. It's a little more highly attenuated and it's a little more hoppy. It's You can sort of think of it as a transition from like Doppelbocks in the winter. You want a big malty, sweet, sort of very strong beer. And in the summer, you might want more like if you're going to drink a lager, it might be something more like a Helles. And a Maibock is sort of, somewhere in the middle of those two. It's, normal Bock strength, which is stronger than, stronger than a normal Pilsner, but, weaker than a Doppelbock. And, but it's a little more highly attenuated, so it's not quite as sweet. And it's a little more hoppy, so it's got a little bit more of an edge.
And I have to channel Steve Wilkes and say, that this Maibach would go well in a Marx Brothers movie because one would say, "Is that a U-Bach?" No, that's not a Maibach.
Well, that's not a Maibach.
So could you describe it as like a big fat Pilsner or an Imperial Pilsner or is it different?
That's kind of an interesting question because there are a variety of different pale lagers out there. There's Helles, there's Pilsner, and given that this is a pale lager beer, you might want to make some comparisons. And compared to, if you start as Pilsner as your comparison, like a German Pilsner, all malt, reasonably hoppy, in some ways, it would be like a bigger Pilsner, but maybe not quite as highly attenuated and certainly not as hoppy. And another big difference might be, unless you're talking specifically about Bohemian Pilsner, would be that although Maibachs are fairly hoppy, they're not really a rival to like IPAs or anything in hoppiness, but they're compared to Bock beers, which are lean towards the malty side. Although it's fairly hoppy, it's brewed with soft water with not very much gypsum in it. So it's similar to like if you're going to think about it in terms of like a bigger Pilsner, think about it in terms of like a big Bo Pils or Bohemian Pilsner rather than a big German Pils. But it's still probably as style comparison goes, it's better to think of it as a lighter, or at least I like to think of it starting as a just plain old Bock and then move away from there.
What's our starting gravity range?
The BJCP gives it as 64 to 72 or equivalently 16 to 18 Plato. So, you end up with 6 to 7% alcohol beer, which is, or maybe used to be described as strong, but in the this era of IPAs, now it's normal or session, depending on your liver.
So it's a big beer, but the grain bill is pretty simple, according to your article on beerandwinejournal.com.
Yeah, the grain bill for a Maibach should be almost entirely some sort of pale base malt. Like it can be Pilsner, it could be Vienna, or a mix of those two. And a lot of times there's a little bit of Munich added in, but it doesn't. You don't want to go heavy with like Carapils or any crystal malts or anything like that. You want to keep it keep it almost entirely to pale base malts or Munich, which is a slightly higher colored base malt. And maybe as in a lot of Bocks, you can maybe throw in just a pinch of like aromatic malt or melanoid malt to give it that extra maltiness. But the grain bill should be very simple because you want it to be a fairly pale beer on the, if you compare it to, pale ales are very well known style of beer, especially among homebrewers, sort of on the lower, I would say, pretty much the lower half of that color range is where you want to be for a Maibach.
And since you are brewing with lightly colored grains, you probably want to do an extended boil to boil off some of the DMS precursors, so you won't get a corny Maibock. Is that right?
Yeah, especially if you're going to use Pilsner malt, which is very lightly killed, or if you're going to use under-modified Pilsner malt, because doing a decoction mash is one option for brewing a Maibock, then you would want a good hard 90-minute boil to boil off all the DMS, or the precursor of it. And if you go with mostly Vienna, with a little bit of Munich, you could probably get away with a 60-minute boil in that case. It'd make it a nice hard boil, but you could do it.
And we're just driving off those DMS precursors that would normally be taken care of if the base malt was roasted or kilned for a little bit longer time at the malting company. But if you get those in your beer, you get kind of a corny flavor.
Yeah, a little creamed corn aroma.
And a little bit of that is okay. In some of the styles, like the Pilsner style, I believe the BJCP says that a little bit of DMS is okay, is appropriate for the style. And, in my Pilsners, I usually wind up with a little bit of the corny flavor, and I kind of like it. But a little goes a long way. So hopping, what do we do for hops?
Yeah, hopping, as I said, it's hoppier than Bock beers, but it's not. I mean, in this day and age, when you describe a beer as hoppy, you need to clarify that it's not, it's not double IPA hoppy, it's not IPA hoppy. It's sort of in the range of pale ale hoppy, but with the soft water, it doesn't always come off that aggressively. Let's see, the BJCP gives the range as 23 to 35. So it's, roughly overlapping where a lot of pale ales are. And what you want to do, sort of unlike pale ales, most of the hopping comes as a bitterness addition, and the later hops are you add less percentage of late hops as you would in a pale ale, and you generally want to go straight across the board with noble hops of some kind. Hallertau is a good choice. Tettnanger, Saaz, any of those. Of those, Tettnanger is probably the spiciest. If you want to add a little kick, little more than average hop kick, you use some Tettnanger in the late boil. But pretty much stick to noble hops, which are relatively neutrally flavored.
So when you say hoppy in this case, you're talking more of a bitterness hoppy character as opposed to like a fruity hoppy character.
Right, yeah, there's less floral aromatics and more hop bitterness, and it's again the hoppy. It's a comparison to Bock beers, not to IPAs.
And when we are talking about, well, first of all, I mean there's no adjuncts in this, right? There's no. Especially because it's a traditional German beer style. You wouldn't want to add sugar, say, to lighten up the mouthfeel.
Right, it's an all malt beer, and you certainly wouldn't want to add sugar because although it's more attenuated than Bock beers, it's not super highly attenuated. It's not like a triple or anything where the final gravity is very, very low, especially relative to the high starting gravity. But given that it's mostly pale malts is the base, is a grist. If you just do a single infusion mash at 152 or whatever, that'll give you about the right level. And you build an adequately sized starter, that'll give you the right amount of attenuation to get what you're looking for. You don't really have to go to any extended lengths like adding sugar to dry it out because it's going to. And also you have to clarify that it's dry relative to Bock beers, which are pretty chewy beers. So yeah, no adjuncts, just straight base malts. Do either a single infusion mash at around 152, somewhere in there would be great. Or do you could do a single decoction mash, or if you want to go nuts, you could do a triple decoction mash,
Mm.
and you know, and hit sort of the normal middle of the road mash rests in those if you do the decoction ones, and that'll give you the uh, fermentability of the wort that you need to get the attenuation in the right range.
Yeah, what mash if you're doing a single infusion mash, what mash temperature should you go for?
152 is a good middle of the road, and given that there aren't any, you don't need to go lower than that because you don't want it as dry as humanly possible, and also you don't have a lot of the specialty grains in there. I mean, you could even probably mash as high as 154 and still have it come out in the ballpark of where you want it, because it's still a box, so it's still got to have some fullness of body and a little bit of sweetness. But yeah, I would say 152 to 154, anything in that range.
So
is
around
probably
68 degrees Celsius.
yeah.
And so if you choose to use highly modern, highly modified malts, you do a single infusion mash. So that's simple. Most of the hops being thrown into the beginning of a boil, that's pretty simple. But this being a big lager, it starts to get tricky, or could be tricky, in the fermentation phase.
Yeah, the recipe for these things, you can make a fantastic one from a very simple recipe. You don't need a laundry list of a bunch of malts. You don't need, tons and tons of hops or different kinds of hops. But for the average home brewer, the make or break part of this beer is going to be the fermentation, because it is a lager, and it is at least a relatively high gravity lager. And this is where building an adequately sized yeast starter is crucial, because if you don't, the fermentation is going to be sluggish. It's just not. It might not reach the the final gravity that you're shooting for, and it might. A lot of homebrewed lagers there's a very distinctive taste to them that I just call a homebrew lager taste, for lack of knowing what it actually is. And if you don't pitch enough yeast, you get that flavor. So what you'd want to do is go to, say, Mr. Malty or any of the other pitching rate calculators. Figure out how much you need. On a beer like that, I might even, that's my cat, Robert Paulson. Find out how large of a starter you need to build. And I would maybe even add 10% to that size, just to, you're not going to overpitch, or, maybe even 20% just on a big lager like that. Give your yeast every chance they have to do that. And I would additionally, this would be a great beer to try krausening on. And one way you could do that is make your wort siphon off, like after you've chilled it, but before you aerate it, siphon off like 10% of it and store it in your fridge. Maybe even if you have a small cooler, take 10% of it, which would be in a 5-gallon size, would only be 2 liters. You can put that like in a sanitized growler. If I was going to put it in the fridge, I'd pack ice around it in like a little cooler just to cool it down to almost freezing. Then let primary fermentation almost end in your normal beer. Then pitch the yeast to that, or warm the reserved beer up, your krausen beer. Pitch that at the correct temperature. Let that get going, and add that to your Maibock. That's called krausening, and what it does is you add some actively fermenting beer late in the fermentation, and the yeast clean up the beer a little bit. They scrub out some of the green beer flavors, and they can. You can also use it as a method to carbonate the beer if you cap the tank at that. But most homebrewers don't do that. But I found that krausening on lagers, especially big lagers, can make a big difference in how the beer comes out. It makes it seem I don't know. I've never had that homebrew lager taste in any beer that I've krausened.
Hmm.
And it also on a big beer, it helps as you near the final gravity you're shooting for. Fermentation is going to slow down a little bit, even if you pitched an adequate amount of yeast. Hitting it with krausen beer right at the end sort of just, it just pushes the fermentation right to the final gravity you want quickly. And it's a little bit of a hassle saving the beer or brewing up the krausen beer separately near the end of the fermentation. But it's a technique that has a lot of benefits, I think.
Now, would doing that krausening step, would that negate the necessity to do a diacetyl rest, or to bring the beer up to close to room temperature so that the yeast scrubs out all those butterscotchy flavors? Would that take care of that, or would you still want to do a diacetyl rest?
A lot of times krausening does take care of the diacetyl. You absolutely don't want any diacetyl in this style, though. So you might want to still, just as a prophylactic measure, as they might say.
It's a family show.
Hey. Just as a preventative measure,
there
let's say, bring the temperature up, close to 60 degrees, either right at the end of fermentation or just after it stopped. It's not going to hurt anything to go through an extra diacetyl rest. If you do the krausening, that's probably going to take care of all the along with the other green flavors that should scrub the diacetyl. But it's simple to additionally do a diacetyl rest, and unless you're trying to rush your Maibock into a keg or bottles, which you're probably not going to, because you're going to need to lager it afterwards anyway. That would be a good idea.
Yeah, it only takes a little bit of diacetyl to make it taste like a butterscotch bomb.
Yeah,
and you don't want that, because it's at least to me, I'm pretty sensitive to diacetyl. It's a very obvious flaw. So talk a bit about the temperature schedule during the fermentation. What's your preference? Do you pitch at ale pitching temperatures and then cool it down, or do you cool down the wort to lager pitching temperatures? Say 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius is typically what I'd use for primary fermentation with lagers. Do you pitch it at a higher temperature and cool it down, or do you cool it down and pitch at that temperature?
My preference is to cool it all the way down to the temperature, or even a couple degrees below, and then pitch, and also make sure that your yeast has been cooled down to close to the temperature of the wort that you're pitching it to. I know a lot of sources, and I think it's more for simplicity, they say to pitch at sort of ale temperatures, wait till the fermentation starts, and then cool it down. But in that case, you have much of your yeast growth is then going to occur at ale temperatures, and it's during the yeast growth that yeast kick off esters and stuff like that. And so when you cool it down after that, you're going to get more. You're going to get a less sort of clean lager tasting beer, and more of a beer that has a little bit of notes of esters and things that would be more appropriate for an ale. And in addition, like, once fermentation generates its own heat, so then it becomes even more difficult to cool the beer down. I favor cooling it down all the way to your fermentation temperature, or even a couple degrees below if that's still within the range that the yeast can handle, and then pitch it at that temperature, and then hold steady. And then if you want to at the end, a diacetyl rest is let it rise to 60 at the very, very end of fermentation, or just afterwards, and that should be a good way to do it.
So 60 degrees Fahrenheit is around 15 Celsius.
Yeah.
The reason I mention those temperatures, the 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius, is because that's where my basement tends to be in the wintertime. And it's starting to get down toward that right now. So it's easy for me to ferment in the primary because I got that place for it. but it may be tricky for you to chill the wort down to lager pitching temperatures. But also on beerandwinejournal.com, there's an article that's listed at the bottom of part 1 of this Maibock article, and that is the easy lager chilling article, where I talk about recirculating, using a little pond pump to recirculate the wort, or recirculate ice water through an immersion chiller, and that way you can get down to lager pitching temperature in a fairly short order. It works in the summertime too, by the way, but it's a lot easier, of course, in the wintertime when the groundwater is usually going to be colder, unless you're living on the equator or somewhere where it's warm all the time. So go ahead.
Or Texas.
You're close to the equator, aren't you?
Seems like it.
So you spend, a couple weeks in primary fermentation? How long do you let it go before you rack to secondary and start to lager?
Yeah, this is a pretty big beer, and you don't ever want to, or in most cases, when you're talking about homebrewing, you don't want to give a certain time length and say this is how long you do it. You want to watch the fermentation and wait till it actually stops. Wait till you stop seeing activity in the airlock, and a couple days after that. And if some people, if you have a way to sample the beer without opening up the fermenter, take a gravity reading. But in general, it's going to take a couple weeks, 2 to 3 weeks to ferment out. It's a fairly big lager. Since they're fermented at colder temperatures, they take longer to ferment, and since it's a little bit higher gravity than a regular, say, Pilsner strength beer, it's going to take a little longer than those would to ferment. So about 2 weeks is probably, if you pitch enough yeast, is probably about right for the whole fermentation. And then let it ferment out, let it come up to 60 degrees for 2 or 3 days for a nice thorough diacetyl rest, and then move it along, get it into the keg or bottles, and or you could also lager it in bulk. But after fermentation and the diacetyl rest, you'll want to give it a couple months, maybe 2 or 3 months to lager, and then it should be ready to serve. You'll read a lot especially in older homebrewing sources. People will give just ridiculously long amounts of time to lager beers, and especially bigger lagers. Like you frequently see, like, oh, you got to lager it for 6 to 8 months, and you don't need that. Yeah, the key is if you haven't pitched enough yeast and you had a struggling, fermentation, then you need a long lagering period to get rid of all the problems that you created by not making a yeast starter. But if you pitch an adequate amount of yeast and you have an ordered fermentation, one that starts in a reasonable amount of time, it proceeds without stalling, hits your final gravity in a reasonable amount of time, and then the yeast drop out or whatever. If you have a nice ordered fermentation like that, where everything goes right, you don't need just tons and tons of lagering time.
And what temperature do you lager at?
I lager just at refrigerator temperature, just because it's easy. If you have the ability, you can lager it closer to freezing, water freezing temperature. But a lot of people just lager it at sort of in the vicinity at least of 40 degrees, which is the setting that like most refrigerators are at. So roughly, I think 40 to 45 Fahrenheit.
And we haven't talked about the yeast strain for the Maibock.
Yeah, pretty much any yeast strain will do, and any lager yeast strain should do pretty good. But the ones specifically, that specifically work well in bocks are going to be your best choice. Ones that are used for Bohemian Pilsners are also another good choice. I think most of those overlap pretty well. There's not the degree of variation in lager yeast that there are in ale yeast, so it's less of a critical thing. But yeah, any lager yeast strain that's recommended for Bock beers will do great in a Maibock.
Now, when it comes to time to package, if you're going into a keg, that's easy. You just force carbonate as you normally would, taking into account with your yeast or your priming sugar calculator that there's going to be more CO2 already in the beer because it's colder. You're bottling colder,
right?
But when you are bottling this beer that has been in the primary for 2 months and in the secondary for 2 or 3 months, do you want to pitch some fresh yeast in there into the bottling bucket?
It sure wouldn't hurt. I mean, you'll probably, if you ferment for 2 weeks and then lager for 2 months, in your secondary fermenter, or if you have a conical and you're blowing out the yeast or whatever, there'll still be viable yeast in there, and you'll most likely be able to carbonate. But if you add some at bottling, add some fresh active yeast, and you won't need even a ton or anything. You can even just take like maybe a quarter teaspoon of USO5 or something. It's a nail yeast, but it's not going to add that much character to a beer that's already fermented out. That'll help you carbonate rapidly, and just take the bottles off and store them on sort of the warm end of room temperature for 2 weeks, and they should carbonate right up, and then just cool them down for several days before you serve them.
And this is in addition to being lagered for a long period of time. It's a bigger beer, so that's another reason why I would repitch some yeast at bottling time, just because I tell people if it's a big beer or if it's been in the fermenter for a long time, you want to make sure that there's some healthy yeast cells in there. Because, it might, if you didn't add fresh yeast, it might still carbonate. It just might take a little longer.
Yeah, it's just adding fresh yeast at bottling when you're making like a very big ale or a big lager. It's just sort of insurance. It's a little bit extra work, but you're just going to have the confidence that, I can get this carbonated, fairly quickly. If you don't, it might either take a long time to carbonate your bottles, or they might start carbonating unevenly, because there's just less healthy yeast in the dissolved in the beer. It's just it's a little extra work, but it's just an insurance policy to make things go apace, simply. Well,
very good. Any other tips that we should be thinking about? It seems like, other than the being careful during the fermentation, it seems like a fairly straightforward beer to brew.
Yeah, there aren't any like super weird twists to it. It's it's a fairly strong lager beer, simple recipe generally. There's no real twists in the thing, other than just make sure, like, the one thing that you really want to take care of is make sure that you're pitching an adequate amount of yeast. If you hit your wort with an adequate amount of healthy yeast, or even I would recommend slightly above, 10 to 20% above what you think you need, your fermentation will go nice. Your beer will be primed to lager in the correct amount of time. And you'll also, carbonation will go a little bit better whether you add yeast or not, just because you started with better fermentation, a healthy yeast. And that would be nice. The number one thing to think about in this beer is the pitching rate.
Excellent. Well, the series is on beerandwinejournal.com. Along with a recipe. I'm assuming you're going to wind up with a recipe.
Yeah, at some point there'll be a recipe.
I hear the lonesome whistle of a train behind you.
Yep, there.
In all the years of talking, I think this is the first time I've actually heard a train at your house.
Huh. Yeah, there's a track right nearby.
I hope. Otherwise, you're going to get a rude surprise.
Yeah.
All right, Chris, I'll let you hop the freight train there, and we will talk to you later.
Talk to you later, James.
Well, thanks again to Chris. You can read his series on Maibock on beerandwinejournal.com. Lots of great stuff on that site, as usual. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Check out our support link where you can throw a couple of bucks into the tip jar by subscribing financially to our podcast. And you will get a link to our bonus video with the cabbage rolls. Be sure to check out our DVDs, Extract Brewing and Partial Mashing, Stepping into All Grain, Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, and Introduction to Wine Kits. You can find them all on our site, and you can check out our Basic Brewing shirts in the store as well. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com, and if there is an vendor in your area, you can order them online in our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. You know how that works. We greatly appreciate the support. When you think of shopping on Amazon, go to our website first, basicbrewing.com, click on the ad, and it will take you there. You can shop as you wish. Our featured products this week that were purchased through that link in that manner: Will It Waffle? 53 irresistible and unexpected recipes to make in a waffle iron. That's cool. And Disney Pixar. This is confusing. Disney Pixar Cars Star Wars Complete Set. Series 1. They're the little cars, and they have Lightning McQueen as Luke Skywalker, X-Wing fighter pilot, Mater as Darth Vader, Mater Vader, Sally as Princess Leia, excuse me, Luigi and Guido as C-3PO and R2-D2, Tractor as a Stormtrooper, Fillmore as Yoda. Oh my goodness. I can't mispronounce Leia. I saw it in the theater when it was out the first time. Thanks again, everybody. And remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We greatly appreciate your support. Don't forget, you can also join the American Homebrewers Association and subscribe to Brew Your Own magazine through the associate links on basicbrewing.com. That's all until next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.